What if 23 years of love, loyalty, and sacrifice could be reduced to ashes by a single betrayal? Tonight's story will take you from the innocence of first vows to the devastation of broken trust, and the cold fire of revenge that followed. You'll witness not only the collapse of a marriage, but also the rebirth of a man who refused to be defined by betrayal. Welcome to Cheating Stories 7. If you've ever wondered what betrayal costs, or what true resilience looks like, this story will show you. Don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Now, let's step into the drama of 23 years of loyalty shattered. I turned my cheating wife's world to ashes. We met at 17, in hallways that smelled like pencil shavings and floor wax, when the loudest decision of the day was which mixtape to play on the ride home. Laura moved as if the lockers were an aisle and the bell a cue. There was poise in her stride that made everything look intentional. I was the kid who showed up early to help a coach set out cones, convinced that practice could solve almost anything. We started with borrowed hoodies, cafeteria trades, and the careful clumsiness of two people trying to learn one another's edges without cutting skin. Friday games and cheap pizza. Long phone calls that ended only because a parent picked up the line. The quiet relief of finding someone who understood the inside jokes and the outside fears. By 22, we wore rings that turned errands into partnership. Apartment leases surrendered to a mortgage. Our weekends began at a hardware store where the clerk learned our names and the coffee vendor knew our order. I spoke the language of instruction manuals and stud finders. Laura learned which color swatches meant sunny and which meant regret. We split the house without a chart. I took gutters, hedges, leaky faucets, and the fence post that never stood straight no matter how many times I reset it. She ran the inside like a conductor, lists, coupons, timing dinner to the minute, and the little economies that made two modest salaries feel like more than enough. The boys arrived like bell chimes, Adam first, with solemn eyes that studied before trusting. Then Ryan, all laughter and kinetic grace that made the neighbors forgive our sleepless nights. The house rearranged itself around cribs and car seats, around the cartography of small socks that disappeared in the dryer and reappeared under couches. We made tradition out of the affordable. Friday takeout on the living room floor, Sunday walks by the river to look at houses we could not afford and test drive the future with our feet. Holidays were a patchwork of hand-me-down ornaments and new recipes that didn't always work. We called failures notes for next year and ate them anyway. There were seasons that tested us, a layoff that turned the pantry into a strategy session where potatoes pulled double shifts, and we learned 10 ways to use rice. A family illness that rearranged weekends into corridors with hand sanitizer and vending machines. And a miscarriage that taught us grief does not need years to be deep. We did not chronicle those months online. We cooked. We held hands in waiting rooms. We tried again. When money thinned, I took extra shifts and sold a set of tools I loved because the arithmetic of our future made the decision for me. When fatigue laid claim to her smile, I handled bedtime and dishes and called it romance. If love is a house, ours was built from chores no one applauds. I replaced squeaky hinges so doors would close softly and babies would keep sleeping. She knew the bakery 2 blocks over by the smell that meant the bread had just come out of the oven. I learned that forgiveness sometimes sounded like a dishwasher running after midnight, and that the deepest devotion is often invisible on purpose. We did not aim for fireworks. We aimed for a steady pilot light that never went out. We argued, because 2 adults sharing one roof also share fatigue. Our fights were the kind that leave no witnesses, whose turn to pick up whether a colleague's tone was rude or just tired, which vacation we would not take this year. Sometimes we were unkind. Sometimes we apologized without knowing how to repair the original cut. But we never threatened the door with our backs. We never made leaving an option. When strain showed up, we closed ranks like old soldiers. When the checking account groaned, we made soup and plans. When our patience ran thin, we went to the park and let the wind talk for us until we could do it better. I believed in ordinary heroism, coming home on the days you don't want to, buying the cheap bouquet because the day needed a color, changing the oil in the driveway so the car would carry us through another winter. I believe devotion glows brightest in unremarkable hours, packing lunches, tightening loose cabinet pulls, falling asleep to an old movie we swore we'd finish tomorrow. I believed that knowing someone since youth meant knowing them forever. The lighthouse of my attention, I told myself, reached every wave. What I did not notice, what I could not imagine, was the slow drift that looks like weather until it becomes climate. Routine is a gift until it turns into camouflage. Somewhere between installing a ceiling fan and refinancing a loan, a hairline fracture formed where our vows had once been seamless. Laura began leaving for work with a composed face, the kind you practice in a mirror until it becomes a second skin. Her phone, once a shared toy for recipes and family photos, turned into a private pulse. She still laughed at the right moments. She still kissed the boys goodnight. She still checked the calendar on the fridge. But sometimes, while I measured a board or budgeted a month, I felt a draft in a closed room and blamed the window instead of the wall. I kept believing because belief had served us. It had carried us through lean months and sick rooms and the low-grade humiliations every couple suffers and survives. Stability felt like love's native language, and I spoke it fluently. If there is a tragedy in beginnings, it is this. You can mistake longevity for immunity. You can live so long inside a story that you forget stories can be rewritten without your consent. I sanded stair rails smooth and called the dust proof of progress, never guessing that somewhere a different story was measuring us for replacement. Years reward the faithful, people like to say. They forget that years also offer exit ramps to anyone who studies the curves. I did not see an exit forming. I did not imagine another plot recruiting the woman I loved. I trusted the arithmetic of our history, certain the sum would always be us. I believed the future was guaranteed because we had earned it. And in that confidence, warm, deserved, blinding, the first crack became real. Pain didn't arrive with spectacle. It signed in with paperwork. One wrong pivot at work, a rip like Velcro inside my knee, and suddenly my calendar belonged to surgeons and physical therapists. The brace squeaked at night. I learned the staircase like a mountaineer studies switchbacks, one careful step at a time. I couldn't hoist the laundry basket. I couldn't crouch under the sink to hush the drip that counted seconds. I couldn't carry lumber from the truck the way weekends used to begin. Workers' comp sounded practical until it became a room I couldn't leave. Then the city locked down. Sirens braided the days. Storefronts promised we'll be back soon, and no one knew what soon meant. Laura's schedule stretched thin. Extra coverage, she'd say, or they need me late. Responsible words, heroic even. I wanted to be proud without also feeling abandoned by the hours. Pride and loneliness can share a chair. I missed the dojo, the gym, the loud proof I was more than a paycheck. At home, I kept rituals, coffee at the same time, stretches at the maple window, icing and heat. I apologized for moving like furniture being slid instead of lifted. Laura waved it off. Don't worry about it. But worry multiplied in the corners anyway. We had already been cooling. Now the thermostat clicked off. Intimacy went cold. She came home with the drained look of someone polite for 12 hours. I tried patience instead of needs. How was it? I'd ask. She'd give the little shrug that says, let's not add to the pile. I started saying sorry for the basket I couldn't carry and the bulb that stayed burned out because the latter felt like a dare. Usefulness began to feel like the currency of love, and I had nothing small enough for change. Entropy left its calling cards. A cabinet door learned a new angle. The garden needed hands we didn't have. The bedroom looked like a waiting room, neutral, tidy, perfumed with caution. Laura's phone became a metronome. It lived face down but always within reach. It hummed. It needed acknowledgement. Once she started to show me a recipe and then didn't, as if the motion itself had embarrassed her. At sunset, we used to stand shoulder to shoulder on the back step. the kind of quiet that counts as intimacy. One evening, I leaned into her with muscle memory and felt the slightest stiffening, the body's way of guarding a bruise. She smiled, tight, efficient, and went to change. I told myself a story about fatigue, about masks and distance, about how the whole world had learned to wave through glass. Nights lengthened in ways clocks can't measure. I lay awake cataloging sounds, the refrigerator's throat clearing, the baseboard's clicks, the argyle rhythm of the brace when I shifted. I remembered when she met me at the door for no reason except that I had arrived. Expecting a reward for endurance felt ridiculous. Calling it ridiculous felt worse. Pride kept me quiet. Hope kept me patient. The distance kept growing. We did not fight, no slammed doors. We kept a polite truce of calendars and courteous questions. Do you need the car? Did you feed the dog? Should the uniforms go in tonight or morning? Beneath the truce, a battlefield wrote itself in invisible ink. We did not admit the map because admitting it would require choosing sides. I was still trying to be on hers. Attempts at closeness felt like debits. When I reached for her hand, she patted mine, as if congratulating me for trying. If I suggested a movie, she was too tired. If she suggested one, she fell asleep before the opening credits ended. I felt like a petitioning employee dismissed kindly by a manager who cannot spare more time. I hated the metaphor and could not escape it. I adjusted my role to avoid adding weight to a back already bent. I cooked simple food and oversalted it because I couldn't taste anything except the afterimage of what we used to be. I learned tasks I could do sitting down. I ordered parts that would wait. I said yes to the boys more quickly, to give them a father who felt present even while diminished. I kept a list titled "When My Knee Works Again" and treated it like prayer. Her phone chimed again and again, the digital heartbeat of a life that seemed to need her differently than we did. She didn't share memes anymore. She didn't press her shoulder into mine to show a video. She offered clipped answers that closed the door politely behind them. Sometimes she stood in the hallway a beat too long after a call, ironing her expression before entering a room. I recognized the pause and ignored it. The brace loosened. Range returned by inches. I wanted to believe that as the joint thawed, our life would too. I marked a date to drive to the hardware store alone. The morning came, I drove, I cried in the parking lot because an aisle full of possibilities felt like a language I used to speak. I bought sandpaper and hope, but damage isn't always loud, it hums. One night I woke not because the knee ached or the city shouted, but because a new emptiness had taken up residence. It wasn't the lack of touch, it was the lack of being wanted. The distinction mattered. Wanting is what makes touch mean something. I rehearsed the inventory of reasons: pandemic fatigue, overwork, injury, money, school closures. The litany everyone mouthed that year like an anthem. Each reason explained a symptom and dodged the cause. Morning arrived with more mercy than we deserved. I brewed coffee and apologized for the bitterness. Laura gave the small, efficient smile and said she had to leave early, coverage again. I nodded like a man who believed the word. In the sink, a spoon tapped porcelain twice, the second strike a fraction too hard. It sounded like a gavel. I did not yet know it was calling us to trial. It began with a scroll meant only to pass time. The knee ached after therapy, the ice pack hissed against my skin, and my thumb did what thumbs do when the body is tired. Flick, flick, flick. A coworker of Laura's had posted a carousel from some after-hours gathering. Plastic cups. Fluorescent bar light, the kind of smiles people wear when they are rehearsing how freedom looks. In the third frame, Laura stood with a man I didn't recognize. His hand rested at the small of her back, where the spine meets the slope just above the hips. The place a spouse touches to guide you through a crowd. It wasn't obscene, it was proprietary. I told myself I was misreading the angle, the crop, the moment between moments. I pinched the screen wider and the pixels fractured like glass, but the story didn't. In another photo from another table, the same man leaned in. The slack confidence of someone who expects welcome. His jaw fashionably unshaven. His smile a little too sure. I backed out, clicked the poster's profile, then followed a tag to the man's name, Eric Turner. I tapped to open his page, blocked. The word didn't sound like a thought. It sounded like a verdict read into a quiet room. Heat rose in my chest without anger, just a pressure that made the hallway look longer and the kitchen farther away than it had ever been. Blocked means forethought. Blocked means a curtain someone pulled and then pretended the window was gone. I set the phone down, picked it up again, tried another route, an old comment thread, a mutual tag, a cached preview, same wall, same blank. I stood at the sink and let water run over a glass I'd already cleaned. There are reasonable explanations, I told myself. Maybe he's private with everyone. Maybe it's just an office crush Laura never invited. Maybe he's one of those men who overperforms touch, the kind people forgive because charm makes a mess look like flair. But then came the question that refused to soften around the edges. If he's harmless, why hide him from a husband's view? I stared at that question the way you stare at a stain you hope is shadow. The logic I had built around our life, the trust, the history, the assumption of good faith, wobbled on a hairline crack I could suddenly feel under my feet. I became attentive in the way betrayed people are before they have permission to use the word. I watched time. I counted how long extra coverage took to get home. I noticed that be there in 15 meant 30 or never. I reread text threads that once made me smile and realized how many details were now missing. I studied a smile that didn't reach her eyes when she said she was covering a shift. I audited laughter. I counted the buzzes of her phone without wanting to, like a man trying not to measure a leak. Shame came with the vigilance. I've never liked the flavor of suspicion. It tastes like failure even when it's earned. So I overcompensated. Made dinner with too much care, asked about meetings with too much interest, offered the kind of softness you give a person who seems always on the brink of tears. Laura thanked me. Her phone vibrated on the counter between us. The photographs kept resurfacing in my mind like a pop-up I couldn't close. In them, Laura looked freer than she had at home in months. Not happier, exactly. More available to the moment, as if obligation had stepped out for a cigarette and left delight in charge. It bothered me that the evidence wasn't flamboyant. No kisses. No hands disappearing out of frame. Nothing a lawyer could circle in red. It was the casualness that undid me, the ease of trespass when the boundary had been softened by routine. Eric's name began appearing in other places. A tag here. A group shot there. The breadcrumb trail of modern intimacy. I made excuses until excuses themselves felt dishonest. I reminded myself we had weathered worse than misunderstandings. I also reminded myself that weathering is not the same as welcoming a storm. One evening while Laura showered, I pulled a sheet of paper from the printer and slid the phone onto the copier bed. The photo printed too dark, but the outline was clear. Her shoulder angled toward him, his hand claiming a place that was supposed to be mine. I trimmed the white border with kitchen scissors and folded the image in half, then in half again until it was the size of a driver's license. I tucked it behind my license in my wallet, not as a trophy and not as a threat, but as a marker, a trailhead. If I ever doubted where the light began to change, I wanted to know where to point. I did not confront her, not yet. I was not ready for proof, because proof would ask for a response I did not yet have the legs to make. I told myself the name of 100 benign reasons for being blocked by a man who should not matter. I put the phone on the dresser and tried to memorize the sound of our house as it had always been. The slow-turning fan, the click of the thermostat, the two-beat cadence of footsteps I knew as well as my own. Once, years ago, that sound had meant safety. Now it meant a story in progress that didn't invite me to the author's table. I kept moving through the days as if nothing had shifted. I iced the knee. I loaded the dishwasher. I stood on the back step at sunset and pretended the sky was enough proof that hope deserved fidelity. But the world inside the photograph had already taught me a new vocabulary of distance. When Laura came home and said she was exhausted, I believed her. When she said she had to cover another late shift, I nodded. When her phone chimed and she didn't look up, I learned the shape of silence that follows a door closing softly. At night, I pulled my wallet from my pocket and pressed my thumb against the folded square of paper. I did not unfold it. I did not need to. I knew what it looked like. I knew what it meant. And I knew that someday I would have to decide whether I was the kind of man who could live with that picture without letting it define me, or the kind of man who would go searching for the rest of the album. Mark met me on the back stoop with 2 coffees and the kind of silence that makes room for facts. I laid out what I knew: the cooling house, the late shifts, the photograph with a hand where a husband's hand belongs, the digital wall that appeared when I tried to see Eric Turner's profile. Mark listened without flinching. When I was finished, he gave me the sentence I needed more than comfort. Document, do not confront. He said it twice, as if nailing a board in place. We moved from pain to procedure. Within the limits of the law, I pulled account records and message logs that a family plan keeps whether you pay attention or not. I wasn't hunting scandal to nourish anger. I was hunting truth to guide decisions. Numbers repeated like coordinates. A pattern of pings drew a constellation I had not consented to name. And then it arrived, one evening, with the bluntness of a hammer. A thread lit up between Laura and Eric. Their words carried the casual boldness of people who assume no one is watching. They talked about last night. They wrote that they could not keep their hands off each other. They made plans for this weekend as if weekends were a private country where vows did not apply. There was nothing plausible left to deny. I did not throw the phone. I turned it face down on the table and stared at the blank wall opposite my chair until the wall narrowed to a tunnel, and the tunnel narrowed to a pinprick. I tried to name what I felt and failed. Anger was too hot a word. Grief was too soft. The right word would have to account for betrayal's chemistry, how it strips oxygen from a room and leaves you breathing something metallic. I stood and walked to the sink because the body needs a task. I ran water over a glass that was already clean. I watched it fog and clear. When the tap squeaked, I heard it as if from a long hallway. I imagined our kitchen as a set and wondered how many scenes had already been performed on it while I was at physical therapy counting slow seconds on a clock with blue hands. The next 2 days I moved like a shadow, polite, quiet, impossible to touch. Laura noticed. "Are you okay?" she asked in the doorway, her hand braced against the frame like someone steadying herself on a boat. "I'm tired," I said, and it wasn't a lie. She reached for my shoulder in the kitchen. My body stepped aside before my mind decided to. A flinch can be a sermon. That night I dreamed my wedding band had become a ring of salt. In the dream, I held it in my palm and the lines on my hand filled with white. When I closed my fist, the ring dissolved. I woke with the taste of metal on my tongue and a certainty that did not require daylight to keep its shape. Knowledge settled into me like cold into bones, slow, patient, thorough. I no longer wondered if. I began to measure how long, how often, how close to our children's laughter. I replayed ordinary days with cruel clarity, cataloging errands and text tones and the timing of showers. It was astonishing how much evidence had hidden in plain sight while I gave goodwill the benefit of the doubt. I felt foolish for worshiping at the altar of ordinary heroism. More than foolish, I felt robbed. Robbed of time, of ease, of the version of myself who did not have to think like this. I kept my voice even. I kept the house running. I put the boys' needs in front where they belonged. When Ryan asked if we could shoot hoops once my knee allowed, I said yes faster than a father who had just discovered his life could be divided into before and after. When Adam called to ask if we were still coming for dinner next week, I told him of course and meant it. The center of a family does not have the luxury of collapse. Mark checked in without hovering. "Where are we?" he asked. "Past theory," I said. He told me to sleep when I could, to eat, to keep notes, to talk only to people who could help. He reminded me that confronting without a plan turns the betrayed into an actor in the cheater's play. I wrote that sentence down beside the others. I read my own handwriting like instructions that could save a life. On the 3rd morning after D-Day, I woke before the alarm to a quiet that felt different. It was not peace. Peace has softness to it. This was clarity, hard-edged and bright. Something in me had changed from a man trying to explain the inexplicable to a man who accepts the fact and insists on consequences. I did not want a heart-to-heart. I did not want an apology written by panic. I did not want reconciliation built on the sand of future promises. I wanted a plan. I showered, braced the knee, and sat at the desk with a legal pad. I drew 3 columns: evidence, logistics, communication. In evidence, I listed what I had and what I still needed. In logistics, I wrote the dry details of accounts and leases and locks. In communication, I listed the people who would need to hear from me and those who would not. I left a space for the boys and underlined it twice. I would not let this become a spectacle that fed anyone's appetite for drama. If our life was going to break, it would break clean. Order arrived before anger did. I opened a fresh notebook and wrote headings like a foreman chalking lines on concrete: assets, obligations, passwords, risks. Under evidence, I listed what I had and what I would never again go looking for: time stamps, call logs, message counts. Under legal, I wrote the names of attorneys Mark had vetted, questions about fault, discovery, and how to shield the boys from crossfire. Under logistics, I drew boxes for accounts to separate, keys to collect, a lease to secure. Clarity likes lists. Grief hates them. I chose clarity. Mark's voice lived in my ear the way a metronome lives in a room with an instrument. Document, don't confront. Confrontation gives the cheater a playbook and a podium. Documentation gives the betrayed a map out. I read statutes until my eyes blurred. I rehearsed conversations with a lawyer I had not yet met. I practiced the sentence I would say if I ever had to speak to Laura through counsel. Keep your voice level, stick to the record, do not perform your pain for anyone who helped cause it. On the first page in block letters, I wrote the strategy that found me like a flare in fog. The enemy of infidelity is unpredictability. I underlined it twice. If Laura had learned to hide inside routine, then routine had to go. My schedule became an equation only I could solve. I left earlier than usual and came home later. I put my phone face down in rooms I used to leave it face up in. I changed passwords and security questions to ones only I would know. When asked where I was, I answered with the vagueness of a weather report: around, heading in later. True enough to avoid lies, vague enough to close open doors. I would not narrate my whereabouts to someone who had hidden hers for months. He will not explode, I told myself. He will evaporate. Evaporation is boring to watch. That is part of its power. I stopped reading intimate texts because I realized there was no sentence in them that could help me heal. Every new detail offered only another angle on the same wound. Proof mattered. Stories did not. I downloaded and stored what I needed, dated and labeled, then refused to taste poison just to confirm it was poison. I told only 3 people: Mark, who had already stood on the back stoop and told me how to stay standing; Paul, who knows how to move boxes without questions; and my sister Maggie, who understands that some silences are mercies, not secrets. I swore them to confidentiality. Not because I was ashamed, but because strategy drowns in sympathy. They agreed to be my triangle, 3 points that would hold a frame while I rebuilt the picture. Discipline steadied me. I ate real meals instead of caffeine. I did physical therapy like a man training to leave. I slept when sleep came, even if it arrived like a thief and left with the first light. I stopped checking Laura's face for answers and learned to read my own. I bit back the urge to plead for a version of us that no longer existed. No begging, no bargaining, no scenes. Rage is a short show with a long hangover. I could not afford the ticket. When Laura asked casual questions, "You out late tonight? You need the car tomorrow?" I matched her tone and gave her nothing else. It felt cruel, then freeing. The oldest lie I had told myself was that I owed transparency to someone who had made secrecy a second language. I owed kindness. I owed respect. I owed the truth to our sons. But I did not owe a daily itinerary to the person who had turned our life into a cover. I began to see revenge differently, not spectacle, consequence. Not ruin for its own sake, but a redesign so honest that even our most forgiving friends would understand cause and effect. If this marriage ended, it would end on terms that protected Adam and Ryan, preserved my sanity, and honored the years of work I had already done to be a decent man. I would not torch my own future to make a brighter fire, so I altered small codes. The spare key that once lived in a terracotta pot found a new address. The credit card auto-pay got split. The family calendar lost a few entries that were no longer family business. I cleaned my office of irreplaceable things and boxed them quietly. I made copies of documents and stored them off-site. I checked our insurance like a pilot checks instruments. I practiced leaving in increments so the final departure would be a walk, not a sprint. I kept my tenderness for my sons. When Ryan texted a joke at midnight, I laughed out loud alone in the dark, so my reply would be honest. When Adam called about a small victory at work, I told him I was proud in a voice that did not betray that my life was becoming a ledger. I wanted them to remember a father who was steady, even when the floor moved. Laura noticed the fog without naming it. She measured me with new eyes and found no edges to grip. She grew solicitous on Tuesdays and distracted on Fridays. I recognized the rhythm of someone managing two metronomes and letting both run fast. Once she put a hand on my chest and asked if I was here with her. "I'm in the room," I said. It was not cruelty. It was accuracy. I held my tongue in 100 places I wanted to use it like a blade. I did not ask about late nights. I did not ask about showers that began at the door. I did not ask about the soft glow of a message behind a turned-away shoulder. I asked about the boys, about bills, about appointments. I gave nothing that could be turned into theater. I was building an exit that would not rattle the walls until the day they needed to come down. One evening, while filing yet another labeled envelope, I realized the shape of the man I was becoming. A man who could walk away and not look back, not because he was unfeeling, but because he had felt everything and had finally decided to put feeling in its proper place behind a plan. The doctrine of unpredictability had done its work. In the mirror, I did not see a victim or a villain. I saw a steward of consequences, a father guarding a future, a husband recusing himself from a courtroom his wife had turned into a stage. Unpredictability became a daily practice, not a stunt. I texted Mark to say I'd help him rearrange his garage, and I actually did, staying late enough that the air smelled like rubber and solvent when I came home. On other nights, I met Paul behind his shop to tinker with a junked motorcycle we both knew would never run. The point wasn't the machine. The point was grease on my hands and hours I didn't explain. I picked up small projects that required distance, curbside pickups, late drop-offs, a drive out to a hardware supplier who only took orders at the dock. I changed my phone lock screen, changed the recovery emails behind it, stopped leaving my devices plugged in like communal appliances. I paused before answering questions that used to get reflex and detail. "Where are you?" she asked. "South of too many errands," I said. "Headed in. What time will you be home?" "Before late, after done." She stared the way people stare at riddles they've heard before, hearing her own evasions echo back to her from a different mouth. She did not like the sound. I did not apologize for the music. I chose new routines that did not look like routines. A Tuesday run on a different route. An early Saturday drive to a flea market to sell tools I no longer needed. A Wednesday night class that was really me in the public library reading case law about fault and custody. I carried a small notebook that would mean nothing if she ever found it. Lists of parts, measurements, errands. The real notes lived in a place she could not access. My grief learned compartments. I packed it away during daylight and unpacked it at a desk where I taught myself to label what hurt and what simply was. In the messages I was legally able to see, Laura confided to Eric that I had grown distant, maybe unfaithful. Reading it was like biting into something sweet and finding salt. The irony tasted bitter and medicinal. She told him she worried I might show up unexpectedly. She suggested they avoid our house. That sentence burned like acid. not because of what it prevented, but because of what it admitted. I refused to picture him in our kitchen. I refused to surrender my home twice, once to an affair, and again to imagination's cruelty. Instead, I cataloged the time stamps, the phrasing, the pattern of days that formed a rhythm and filed them where they would matter later. The ghost routine worked too well. Laura oscillated between brittle politeness and sudden tenderness, like someone dropping sugar into a well she had already salted. She lingered in doorways, speaking softly. She cooked my favorite meals on nights I had no appetite for nostalgia. One evening, she put on an old sweater I used to notice and asked if I remembered when we bought it. Yes, I said. I did not supply the story. Civility, not intimacy. It felt like learning to walk with a healed knee. You place your weight carefully, refusing to trust too soon. I stopped explaining myself. Explanations had become offerings left at an altar that no longer represented a marriage but the performance of one. I stopped trying to qualify my sorrow to someone who chose not to ask about it when it could have mattered. We shared logistics, schedules, groceries, whether a package had arrived. My voice learned flatness not as a weapon but as insulation. The temperature of the room no longer determined the temperature of my decisions. People think ghosts haunt the living. I learned that sometimes the living must become ghosts to survive their own homes. I took up less space where I once expanded to fill it. I moved around Laura like a courteous stranger on a train, aware of her presence, uninterested in conversation that only bought time for the lie. There was relief in this, a strange lightness. Devotion is heavy when it has nothing honest to carry. Mark noticed I was sleeping better. He said it without a question mark. Paul kept a toolbox at my place, not because he needed it, but because the weight of it reminded me I was building something, even if the blueprint looked like absence. Maggie texted recipes and never asked if anyone else would be eating them. My triangle held. When Laura tried to pull me back with sweetness, I did not punish her for trying. I answered with neutral kindness, clear boundaries. No late-night confessions on couches. No shared showers just because we happened to be awake at the same time. No theatrics, no sighs, no slammed drawers, no sarcastic asides thrown like gravel. If love had become theater, I would not pay for tickets with my dignity. I was saving all my strength for the exit. The metrics that once mattered, daily check-ins, affectionate emojis, faded. In their place, completed tasks, clear calendars, labeled folders. I limited my sentences the way you limit salt on a heart diet, enough to function, never enough to swell. When she asked why I was being so closed off, I told her I was focusing on getting back to full strength. It was the truth, just not the truth she thought she deserved to hear out loud. One night I caught my reflection in the dark window over the sink. The house behind me looked like a stage set, fixed props, good lighting, a door that had learned to open quietly. The man in the glass wasn't a villain and wasn't a victim. He was a strategist weighing variables. He had made friends with patience. He had decided to keep his hands clean so he could pick up his future without leaving fingerprints he'd regret. In another message I was entitled to read, Laura told Eric she was scared of losing me. She wrote it as if fear were an original feeling she had just discovered, as if panic were the same thing as love. The line gave me no joy. It offered only confirmation that the mirror was working, that she was tasting the panic she had poured into me for months. She sent him reassurances, phrases built like cushions. You're important to me. I just need to fix things at home. I don't know what he knows. I can't risk it right now. Eric replied with the aggrieved confidence of a man who believes he has been promised something fate is failing to deliver. I logged the time, the tone, the entitlement, and I closed the file. I started parking a block away, bought groceries at a different store. I learned which door hinges sang and which let me pass like breath. I put a second set of clothes in the trunk, a third copy of documents where no one would think to look. I kept cash on hand, not because I planned to flee, but because an exit shouldn't depend on a battery. Laura asked me on a Sunday morning if I wanted to drive out to the lake. The question came framed like reconciliation, wrapped in borrowed history. I almost said yes out of muscle memory. Instead, I said I had promised Mark I'd help him with a dump run. She nodded, eyes flashing something I might once have named hurt. Now I called it friction. Later that day, she left for a quick stop at the store and returned smelling like a lobby I did not recognize. I wrote down the time. I wiped down the counter. I did not ask what aisle sells perfume called Alibi. The mirror kept turning. When she softened, I stayed consistent. When she sharpened, I stayed consistent. When she accused, I stayed consistent. When she acted like nothing was wrong except me, I stayed consistent. Unpredictability, I learned, does not mean chaos. It means refusing to be choreographed by a lie. It means breaking the pattern the affair depends on to thrive. When the house went dark, I stood by the window again and watched the streetlight pour a square of order onto the sidewalk. Somewhere a TV laughed. Somewhere a dog barked and stopped. I stood long enough for my reflection to fade and the outside to come into focus. The future was not a shape yet. It was a direction. I would keep walking toward it, without explaining to anyone why my steps made no sound. The night it broke, nothing looked cinematic. No storm outside, no slammed doors, just the hum of the refrigerator and the hollow tick of a clock that hadn't mattered in years. Laura stood by the counter, scrolling, half smiling at something that lived in the dark of her phone. I watched her thumb move, a tiny motion with the weight of an avalanche behind it. My voice arrived before my fear could stop it. "Who are you laughing with?" Her head snapped up like she'd been caught stealing oxygen. She forced a chuckle, a deflection. "Just a meme, you wouldn't get it." The way she set the phone face down made it clear. This was no meme. I didn't move. "Show me." The sentence had no volume, but it landed heavy. She crossed her arms the way a child hides something behind their back. "You don't trust me?" she asked. It was not a question. It was an accusation meant to flip the script. I didn't give her the satisfaction of answering. The silence stretched until the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Finally, she sighed, pushed the phone across the counter with 2 fingers. "Fine, look. I picked it up." Messages glowed in a thread with Eric Turner. I didn't have to scroll far. Last night was perfect. "I miss your hands already. He suspects, but I'll handle it." My thumb stopped on that last one. "He suspects, but I'll handle it." The words didn't just confirm what I knew. They mocked the very patience I had built to survive. I set the phone down, slowly. My body wanted to rage, to slam it against the wall, to make her flinch the way I had flinched at every late night, every unexplained smile. But rage was her stage. I refused to audition. Instead, I laughed, not with humor, with recognition, with the absurdity of watching 23 years collapse into sentences typed in the dark. The laugh startled her. She stepped back, color draining from her face. "What's so funny?" she asked, voice cracking. "You," I said, "both of you, the arrogance, the secrecy dressed up as romance, the idea that I wouldn't see what was right in front of me." I shook my head, still laughing. "You thought you were the playwright. Turns out you were just actors in a script I already read." Her lips parted, searching for a line, but the script had burned. The silence that followed wasn't mine to fill. I let her flounder, let her realize that every excuse sounded like a confession with different punctuation. Finally, she whispered, "It's not what you think." I laughed again, harder this time. The sound echoed off tile and drywall, filled the kitchen until even I wasn't sure if it belonged to me. "Not what I think," I said. "I've got call logs, messages, photographs, enough proof to bury every version of not what you think." I leaned closer, voice low. "Do you know what the worst part is?" Her eyes welled, but I didn't stop. "The worst part isn't that you cheated. It isn't even that you lied. The worst part is how ordinary it all looks, how small, how cliché. You gave away 23 years for a man who blocks husbands and recycles lines." Laura crumpled into a chair, hands shaking. "I can explain," she whispered. I straightened, steady. "I don't need explanations. I need consequences." The laughter was gone now, replaced by a calm so sharp it scared even me. She stared at me like she was seeing someone she didn't recognize. She was right. The man who once begged for harmony had left the room. What stood in his place was someone who could dismantle the stage without raising his voice. The refrigerator hummed on. The clock ticked. Laura wept softly into her palms. And I stood silent with the clarity of a man who knows the war is no longer invisible. It had stepped into the open, and I had already written the ending. The confrontation changed everything and nothing. Laura wept, begged, whispered half excuses into her hands, but I had already crossed the threshold where explanation matters. Words are cheap, paper isn't. So I called the attorney Mark had recommended, the one whose voice on the phone carried the calm authority of someone who has shepherded men through the fire before. We met in a quiet office with shelves lined like sentinels, ledgers, statutes, binders thicker than grief. I laid out the evidence, the printed photograph, the logs, the messages. He didn't blink. He only asked, "Do you want to punish her or protect yourself?" The question sat between us like a coin on its edge. Both, I said. We built a ledger that afternoon, line by line, account by account. Joint became separate. Ours became mine, debts divided like bones at a butcher's block. He showed me how to secure credit, freeze assets, reassign beneficiaries. He drew a map where escape wasn't running. It was walking, steady, one notarized document at a time. I listened like a man memorizing exit routes in a burning theater. At home, I began the second phase. Locks changed quietly, one cylinder at a time. The spare key in the terracotta pot was gone. The garage code reset. The Wi-Fi password rewritten. Every shift subtle, small enough to pass unnoticed for days. But in my chest, each was a rung on a ladder away from fire. Laura sensed the air changing. She grew frantic in bursts, affectionate in others. A dinner invitation here, a memory tugged there, but I was no longer a participant. I was an observer, logging each move like a detective too polite to interrupt a suspect mid-confession. The boys remained my compass. Every decision had to protect their stability. Custody, support, schedules, words that now carried the weight of artillery. I wanted them shielded from spectacle, but also old enough to see what dignity looks like when tested. The lawyer called it best interests of the children. I called it fatherhood. Paul helped me clear out a storage unit. Documents, heirlooms, boxes of photographs that might matter someday when memory needed proof of a better past. Maggie handled quiet errands, copies, notaries, the errands you can't explain to a spouse without unraveling the whole thread. Mark checked in like a clock I could set by. "You're steady?" he asked. Steadier than her, I answered. Laura's messages shifted tone. One night she accused me of being distant. The next, she accused me of hiding something. I almost laughed. If only she knew how much was hidden, just not in the way she thought. Her affair had been built on shadows. Mine was built on light, documents, dates, locks that turned only one way. The attorney reminded me, confrontation is theater, but the courtroom is architecture. "You don't build a house with emotions," he said. "You build it with foundation and frame." I believed him, so I stayed quiet when provoked. I stayed polite when cornered. I stayed consistent when chaos begged me to break rhythm, because unpredictability had bought me time. Now discipline would buy me freedom. The last ledger I kept was private, not assets, not debts, but memories. I wrote down moments that still had weight. Ryan's laugh when I taught him to drive. Adam's first guitar chord strummed in the garage. The day Laura and I once painted the nursery and left our handprints on the wall behind the crib. I kept them not as excuses, but as reminders, what I had already built and what I refused to lose. The lawyer called it evidence of character. I called it my spine. By the time Laura realized the locks had changed, the ledger was already written. By the time she asked why the bills looked different, the accounts were already separate. By the time she understood the silence in me, the exit had already been secured. There was no explosion, no spectacle, just a man who had already walked halfway out of a house while still standing in its kitchen, and a woman staring at the mirror he left behind. Her name surfaced like a match strike in a dark room, Clara. Laura's oldest friend, once a fixture in our kitchen, then gone without explanation 5 years ago. I had not asked why. Laura had said something vague about distance, different lives. Now Clara was back, not at our door, not yet, but on social media, in whispers from neighbors, in the way Laura stiffened when her name appeared on a feed. Clara's return was not an accident. I knew enough by then to see the choreography. A woman who once sat at our table and knew the smell of our paint, the cadence of our dinners, suddenly visible again just as Laura's affair threatened to tip into exposure. A trigger carefully placed. Whether by design or coincidence, I would use it. Clara reached out, not to Laura, but to me. A message in the quiet hours. I'm sorry I disappeared. I thought I was helping you by staying away. Can we talk? The apology carried weight I hadn't asked for. The phrasing carried implication. Helping me. By staying away, I let the words sit before answering. Yes, I typed. But not here. We met in a public place, a coffee shop where anonymity hummed like white noise. Clara arrived looking older, sharper, not worn down, but refined by years I didn't witness. She didn't waste time. I left because I knew, she said. I stared. Knew what? Her eyes didn't flinch. About Eric, about her. It wasn't my story to tell, and I didn't want to be collateral damage in your house, but I couldn't carry it anymore, so I left. The words landed like gravel in a glass. I had suspected timelines, wondered about accomplices, but hearing it said plainly that the betrayal had history, witnesses, accomplices silent by choice, lit a fire different from grief. It lit strategy. Why now? I asked. Clara folded her hands around the mug. Because she's unraveling, and because you deserve to know I wasn't silent out of malice. I thought I was sparing you. I see now I only delayed the inevitable. I didn't thank her. I didn't scold her. I just asked for details, and she gave them places, dates, patterns, enough to confirm the architecture of deception went further back than even my files suggested. That night I sat at my desk and reshuffled my ledgers. Clara wasn't proof in a legal sense, but she was leverage. Her testimony could fracture Laura's defense if custody turned hostile. Her presence alone might trigger Laura's panic into mistakes. And panic, I had learned, is evidence's favorite twin. At home, Laura noticed my stillness. You're quiet, she said, trying to sound casual. I've been listening, I answered. To her, it sounded cryptic. To me, it was precise. Over the next week, Clara's shadow did the work I no longer had to. Laura grew twitchy, watching her phone like a stage manager afraid of missed cues. When Clara's name appeared in conversation, Laura's tone sharpened, defensive before anyone accused her. It was as if the mere presence of her old friend turned every room into a mirror she couldn't avoid. One night she snapped, "Why are you talking to her?" I hadn't mentioned Clara once, which told me she had already rehearsed the scene in her head. I met her eyes across the table. She reached out, I said simply. That silence after my answer was longer than the one after I first confronted her. She knew the trigger had been pulled. The irony was clear. She had spent months hiding messages in the dark, and now one message from a forgotten friend threatened to collapse her scaffolding. This time I didn't laugh. I just watched her crumble piece by piece the way a structure falls when termites have already eaten the beams. Mark called it timing. Paul called it luck. Maggie called it justice. I called it necessary. Because sometimes you don't need to set fire to burn a house down. You just need to open a door and let in the person holding a mirror. Affairs are built on shadows, but shadows starve in the open. After Clara's return, the seams began to split. Laura's phone lit up more often, not less. Arguments disguised as affection. Messages sent, then deleted. Calls cut short before the hello was finished. I didn't have to read them to know their tone. The rhythm was gone. The intoxication that once fueled them had soured into paranoia. Eric Turner had patience for secrecy. He had no patience for uncertainty. He pressed her where she was when we spoke, what I knew. He wanted her to promise the impossible, a clean exit with no cost. Laura tried to juggle him and me, but the weight slipped. She accused me of distance. She accused me of changing locks, changing schedules, changing rules. Each accusation was a confession in different clothing. I listened, calm. Every word she threw landed on my growing file of evidence. Mark called it pressure cracks. I called it justice in slow motion. The irony was almost artful. Laura and Eric had once thrived in silence, private messages, secret rendezvous. Now they drowned in noise, her excuses. His demands, her fear, his entitlement. What they once called passion had become performance, rehearsed lines in a play with no ending they could agree on. I overheard one call, not the words, just the tone. her voice sharp, defensive. His voice raised, muffled, but unmistakably angry. A slammed door ended it. When she saw me in the hallway, she pasted on a smile so brittle it cracked before it reached her eyes. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded too fast. It was answer enough. The affair began to eat itself. I could see it in the way Laura checked her phone like it was a live grenade, in the way she jumped at messages instead of savoring them, in the way she searched my face not for love, but for signs of what I knew. Trust is the first casualty of betrayal, and now their betrayal had turned on them. Clara's presence accelerated the collapse. She posted a photograph, an ordinary dinner with friends. Laura's comment beneath it was polite, clipped. Eric saw it. I know because the next night Laura muttered about jealousy and control into her phone before storming out of the room. It was almost poetic. The same jealousy she once denied me now consumed the man she betrayed me with. I did not intervene. I cooked meals, paid bills, spent time with the boys. I built a life so steady it cast their chaos into sharper relief. Every smile at my sons, every quiet evening spent in order was another contrast to the disorder she had chosen. She had wanted excitement. Now excitement tasted like ashes. One night, after another whispered fight ended with silence, Laura sat across from me at the table. Her eyes were red. She reached for my hand like a reflex. I didn't move mine. She whispered, "He thinks I'll leave you. He thinks it's that simple." I looked at her steady. "And will you?" Her silence was louder than any answer. I leaned back, calm. "Then he's already lost, and so have you." The clock ticked between us. For the first time, she didn't argue. She just sat there, caught between two worlds collapsing at the same speed. The affair had started as her escape. Now it was her prison, and I was holding the keys not to save her, but to walk out myself. Holidays don't pause betrayal. They just dress it in formal clothes. Thanksgiving came with its usual choreography, turkey thawing in the sink, pies boxed in the fridge, relatives pulling into the driveway with arms full of dishes and voices full of habit. From the outside, we looked intact. From the inside, we were hollowed like the pumpkin centerpiece on the table. Laura moved through the kitchen like an actress who knew her lines. She smiled at my mother, complimented Maggie's casserole, poured wine into my father's glass without spilling a drop. Every gesture flawless, every glance rehearsed. I matched her, not to protect her, but to protect my sons, to preserve one last image of order before truth broke into shards. The performance was for them, not for us. Ryan joked with his uncle about football. Adam played guitar softly in the corner, filling silence with chords that sounded braver than words. I carved the turkey. Laura passed the plates. To anyone watching, we were family. To me, it was theater staged on borrowed time. Clara arrived late. Her presence turned the air electric. She hugged relatives with practiced ease, but when she met Laura's eyes, something shifted, too brief for anyone else to catch, but sharp enough to cut both of us. Laura's smile faltered. Her hand tightened around a wine glass. I saw panic ripple under her skin through dinner. I played my role. Laughter where expected. Stories told at safe volume. A nod when someone raised a toast. All while watching Laura disintegrate in small ways, her fork trembling, her eyes darting, her voice pitching higher when Eric's name floated up accidentally in a cousin's unrelated story about work. The room didn't notice, but I did. After pie, the family gathered in the living room, the television glowing with muted sports commentary. Laura excused herself to the kitchen. I followed minutes later, silent, unseen until I chose to appear. She leaned against the counter, phone in hand, typing furiously. I cleared my throat. She jumped. I didn't need to ask who she was writing to. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, desperate. I studied her calm. "Do what?" "This charade, pretend, smile for everyone." I shook my head slowly. "This isn't for you, it's for them." Her eyes shone wet. "They'll hate me." I leaned closer, voice low. "They'll know you." The phone buzzed in her hand, Eric's name flashing across the screen before she could lock it. Her face drained of color. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't have to. The mask had slipped. And Clara, standing at the doorway with her coat in hand, saw everything. Her eyes met mine, then met Laura's. Nothing was spoken. But silence has a way of telling the whole story. When we returned to the living room, Laura's smile was stretched too thin, brittle as spun sugar. I sat beside my sons, steady, anchoring them with presence alone. The masquerade continued another hour, long enough for coffee to cool and guests to pack leftovers. But the performance was already ruined. The stage had cracked, and everyone who mattered had seen the fissure, whether they admitted it or not. That night, when the house was finally empty and dishes stacked like monuments to ritual, Laura collapsed at the table. "This can't be fixed," she whispered. I didn't argue, because for the first time she was right. The masquerade had ended. The curtain had fallen. And what waited beyond was not applause, only consequence. There are conversations you never rehearse because rehearsal is impossible. Telling your children that the world they trusted has been broken is one of them. The morning after Thanksgiving, I sat at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of coffee and no appetite. Ryan and Adam shuffled in, still smelling of sleep, unaware that this day would mark the before and after of their family. I didn't start with betrayal. I started with love. "I need you both to hear this from me," I said. My voice felt like stone, heavy but steady. They exchanged a glance, sensing the weight before the words. "For 23 years, I've done everything I could to keep this house steady. But your mother has been living another life with someone else, and it's not rumor, it's fact." The silence that followed was the kind that makes clocks sound cruel. Adam spoke first. "Since when?" I answered with honesty, not precision. "Long enough that I can't pretend anymore. Long enough that I had to choose between protecting you with silence or protecting you with truth." Ryan's jaw clenched. He didn't look at me. "Does she admit it?" I closed my eyes briefly. "She doesn't need to, the proof is there." The boys reacted differently, as brothers often do. Adam's face cracked into disbelief, grief leaking out as anger. Ryan folded inward, quiet, his silence louder than shouting. Both reactions hurt. Both reactions were fair. I told them what mattered most. "This is not your fault. This is not your burden. You are not the glue for a marriage that already tore. You are my sons, and nothing she did changes that." My voice broke on the last sentence. Adam wiped his face with his sleeve. Ryan finally looked at me, eyes glassy but steady. "So what happens now?" he asked. I slid 2 envelopes across the table, one for each. Inside, letters I had written in nights too sleepless to do anything else. Words I couldn't trust my voice to carry. Letters that told them I loved them, that they were my anchor, that I wasn't walking away from them, only from the lie we had all been forced to live inside. Ryan opened his, skimmed, then folded it carefully as if it were fragile. Adam pressed his unopened letter to his chest. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. Laura entered the kitchen then, barefoot, eyes swollen. She froze at the sight of the envelopes. The boys' faces, my steady calm. No one invited her into the conversation. No one needed her lines in this act. For once, she wasn't the center. She was the shadow on the edge of a truth she could not rewrite. When the boys left the table, I stayed behind. The kitchen felt different now, emptier but cleaner, like a wound finally drained. I knew they would carry scars, but I had given them a landing place, not just a fall. And in betrayal's long war, that was the only victory that mattered. Grief had done its work. Now came precision. I called it Operation Ghost. Not because I wanted to vanish, but because I wanted her to feel the weight of absence before I was gone. The evidence was ready. Photographs, logs, screenshots printed in sequence. Dates circled in red, cross-checked with receipts and timestamps. Not wild accusations, not emotional rants. A record so clinical it could have been filed in an archive. Mark had drilled it into me. Judges don't care about pain. They care about proof. So I gave him proof. The envelopes came next. One for my lawyer, case files, financial records, a custody proposal drafted with quiet ferocity. One for Laura, served by a process server, not by me. One for the boys, letters I had already written, now sealed with the steadiness they deserved. One for myself, a copy of everything tucked away in a safe deposit box, a reminder that ghosts still need anchors. The exit wasn't dramatic. It was orchestrated, bank accounts already secured. Storage unit filled with what mattered. Locks changed weeks ago, documents notarized. By the time Laura noticed the silence, the machinery was already moving. She found the envelope on the counter the morning after I left it there. Inside, my signature on divorce papers, my custody request, my statement. No insults, no apologies, no plea for understanding, just facts, like a surgeon's note after an amputation. When she called, I didn't answer. When she texted, the messages stayed unread. When she wept into voicemails, I saved them, but not out of sentiment, out of necessity. Proof, always proof. Paul checked in, voice taut with quiet pride. You're almost clear. Maggie asked if I was steady. I was, because ghosts don't flinch. Laura's panic grew in inverse proportion to my silence. The more I withheld, the louder she became. But her noise only underscored her guilt. Even the boys noticed. Ryan muttered, "She's unraveling." Adam nodded, silent but certain. The final stage of Operation Ghost was absence itself. No confrontation, no second chance, no drawn-out arguments. Just the sound of a door shutting gently, followed by the echo of a house too empty to disguise itself anymore. I wasn't running. I wasn't hiding. I was leaving on my own terms, and leaving behind a silence heavy enough to haunt her every room. When a bomb goes off, the blast is instant. But the fallout, that's what lingers. By the time Laura realized how much ground she had lost, the consequences were already radioactive. Word spread faster than fire on dry grass. Not from me. I never needed to speak. Silence, documents, and timing did the talking. Relatives who once sang her praises now spoke in lowered tones. Neighbors who once waved now looked past her. Friends who once envied her perfect life began excusing themselves from her invitations. The affair hadn't just broken a marriage. It had broken the illusion that protected her reputation. At church, the empty space beside me shouted louder than sermons. The absence of her hand on my arm was more noticeable than any gossip. An empty chair is never neutral. It accuses without speaking. At Adam's recital, her seat was there but untouched, a vacant outline surrounded by whispers. At Ryan's game, she cheered too loud, too forced, trying to drown out the silence sitting between us in the bleachers. But the louder she tried to fill it, the emptier it became. Eric was no savior. The cracks that had split their affair now widened into craters. Jealousy curdled into arguments, arguments into threats. She had traded a home for chaos, a husband for a critic, stability for suspicion, and the man she had risked everything for had already begun to retreat. Affairs don't survive the sunlight, and she was standing in full noon. The legal filings hit like shockwaves, custody hearings scheduled, property divisions charted like battle maps. The lawyer's voice steady in my ear, "You're in control, stay steady, don't deviate." I obeyed, not out of vengeance, but because steadiness itself had become my weapon. Laura called late one night, her voice shredded. "They won't look me in the eye," she whispered. "They look at me like I'm—" I didn't finish her sentence for her. Some truths don't need articulation. "Actions have echoes," I said instead. "Some last longer than applause." The silence on her end lasted a full minute before the line went dead. At home, the boys adjusted slowly. The empty chair at dinner was a wound, but also a boundary. We set new routines, simpler, cleaner. Laughter returned, not constant, but real when it came. I learned to cook without rushing. They learned to fold laundry without complaint. We learned to breathe without waiting for the next outburst. The fallout was still there in fragments and whispers, but so was healing. The empty chair remained, at the table, at church, at family gatherings, and each time I saw it, I felt the same truth settle deeper. Absence is a punishment no court can order. It's the echo that lives long after the blast, and in that echo I found my calm. When the decree arrived, it felt less like a gavel striking wood and more like a door unlocking. No cheers, no triumph, just silence, clean, heavy, final. I handed the master binder to my attorney. One last ledger closed, one last archive sealed. Then I stored a copy in a locked box, not as a monument, but as something I promised myself to burn when memory no longer needed proof. That night I wrote 2 letters, one to my future self, one to my sons. To myself I wrote, "Love is not blind, it is vigilant. Fidelity is not a default, it is a daily craft. Do not mistake loyalty for permission to be erased." To my sons, I wrote, you are proof that even in a house built on lies, truth can grow strong roots. Never accept a love that demands silence. Never tolerate a loyalty that feels like self-burial. You deserve better than what we lived, and so do I. Freedom didn't feel like flight. It felt like weight redistribution. Less burden on the chest, more air in the lungs. I wasn't naive. The ashes were still there, scars that no decree could dissolve. But ashes have uses. They remind you what burned. They remind you what never should again. Laura drifted to the margins of my life, not vanished, not erased, but reduced to a name in legal documents and a shadow in the boys' stories. She asked once if I would ever forgive her. I told her forgiveness is not a door she gets to walk through to escape her weather. It's a fire break I build for myself so the past doesn't torch my future. She didn't understand. She didn't need to. I kept my circle close, Paul with his blunt loyalty, Maggie with her quiet steadiness, Clara with her mirror that forced reflection I couldn't avoid. Together they had been scaffolding when my house fell. Now they were simply friends, nothing owed, nothing hidden. As seasons turned, I began to craft a new ethic of love, not built on fear of loss, not on obligation dressed as devotion, but on clarity, on vigilance, on the knowledge that love to be worthy must be both shelter and discipline. One evening, as the boys laughed in the living room, I stood at the doorway and listened. Their voices weren't free of pain, but they were lighter than before. And in their laughter, I heard proof that I hadn't just survived betrayal. I had reclaimed something better, not a perfect life, not a clean slate, but a life where truth was louder than lies, and that was enough. What if 23 years of love, loyalty, and sacrifice could be reduced to ashes by a single betrayal? Tonight's story will take you from the innocence of first vows to the devastation of broken trust, and the cold fire of revenge that followed. You'll witness not only the collapse of a marriage, but also the rebirth of a man who refused to be defined by betrayal. Welcome to Cheating Stories 7. If you've ever wondered what betrayal costs, or what true resilience looks like, this story will show you. Don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Now, let's step into the drama of 23 years of loyalty shattered. I turned my cheating wife's world to ashes.